Practice. Well, we've heard the term practice makes perfect, and already we've dispelled that myth. Practice, in fact, makes permanent. We've also discussed that fatigue is the enemy of good technique. So with that in mind, I've got some suggestions for practice for you, which I'd like you to have a look at the practice tracker below, which is in a download further down, and print that out, and then you can adapt this to whichever sport and whichever person you're using. Each person in each sport is going to require their own practice tracker. Because without keeping a record of these things, we don't know what's working and what doesn't work. This will allow us to keep a track of how many repetitions are performed, and will also allow us to put in some subjective data or qualitative data on top of that quantitative data, so that we can just have a look and see which things are actually working. So you might want to write on "did not work" or "this was very good." So let's talk firstly about blocked practice. Now, blocked practice means precisely that. What you're doing is you're doing a block of practice, then you have a rest, this is the important part, then you do another block of practice. Now, depending on the type of thing that you're doing will depend on how many techniques are in each block. Let's say, for example, if I were a triple jumper, triple jump is particularly stressful on the body. We're not going to do blocks of 10 for that, because 10 triple jumps might constitute an entire session. Similarly with pole vault, which I coach. We're not going to do 10 of each exercise because it's just too many. However, something like a tennis serve, maybe we could do more repetitions of that because it's less stressful on the entire body. So we've got to be a little bit pragmatic, a little bit sensible, if you like, about how many repetitions are in each block. What's really important, though, is that at the end of each block, there's a short period of rest. Now, recent neuroscience research has shown that during that period of rest, that's when the learning occurs. And weirdly enough, as I've mentioned before, it's actually replayed backwards in your mind, and then later on when we sleep, it's played forwards in your mind. So at the end of each block, we would need a rest period of at least 20 to 30 seconds before we do the next block. Now, it's really important that during this rest period, you do nothing, absolutely nothing. Don't talk to your friends, don't look at your phone, don't make notes on things, do nothing during that period. So let me give you an example. I do 10 repetitions of a punch. I'm going to do a demonstration of this in a minute. I do 10 repetitions of a punch, then I have a rest. Then I do another 10 repetitions of a punch. That is 2 blocks of 10 repetitions. So I'm counting up the number of repetitions I do, and each block multiplied by that is how many repetitions I've done in total. When we're new to something, we should be doing these repetitions with no external influence or interference. So if I'm doing a punch onto the punch bag, there will be nothing else occurring around me at the time. So when I'm learning a punch for the first time and I'm doing that punch into the air, there will be no interference around me. All I do is just do the punch into the air. Once that's safe and I've done that sufficient number of times, I would then go maybe onto the punch bag. Now the punch bag does move, so there's a little bit of external interference. So what I'm doing is, with the blocks, I'm making it a little bit more difficult. It's important to do enough repetitions when you're a complete beginner of the simplest version of it before you move on to a more complex version. Here's the thing, it's reversible too. If I start doing punches into the air to start with, and I find that it's not working well enough, and I'm finding it difficult, I just stick with that for now. If I do 3 blocks of 10 and I think, yeah, I'm ready, I could go onto the punch bag, and it doesn't go so well, I go back down a block. So go back down like that. Don't be afraid to reverse it. And sometimes you have good days, sometimes you have bad days. So don't worry that you're not always having the best day. Just back it down a little bit and go and do it again. Now, the next thing I could do after that is do that onto a pad. Then we could do it with an opponent. Then we could do it in sparring. So there'd be 5 separate blocks. Now, here's an interesting thing. Again, neuroscience research that's been done previously, quite a long time ago, has shown that randomizing these blocks actually gives us a better result in terms of retention, how well it's retained in my brain. So it might be that I do 10 punches into the air. Then I do 10 on the bag, then 10 in sparring, and then I keep changing the order. I keep changing that order around, and this randomized practice actually gets better results in terms of retention. Who would have thought? But that's what the sports science and that's what the neuroscience tells us. So what we can do is we can randomize those blocks. I must admit, when it comes to randomizing blocks, I must admit I prefer to do things in sequence. So if I was doing something complex like a pole vault, I prefer the blocks to be separate and then in sequence rather than mixing them up. That's anecdotal evidence, but I find that that works better for my athletes. But certainly, the sports science does tell us that randomized practice leads to better retention. My suggestion is to use the practice tracker below, and then you can fill in the gaps and you can randomize the practice blocks as you see fit. But don't go into doing something too technically difficult if the person you're teaching finds it hard. I have a suggestion as to how to practice. Firstly, practice without interference in isolation. All of your blocks in early practice should be that way. Once you've got the hang of that, then move on to randomized practice. Change the blocks around. The example I gave you was on a punch bag, and I'll give you a worked example in a minute, but I would suggest doing those things randomly as a second stage. As a third stage, I then would do it with disruption. So let's say, for example, if I was practicing my punch onto a pad, someone might throw a punch back at me to disrupt me. They may move forwards or backwards to disrupt me. Someone may shout something to disrupt me. Practice several versions of the same skill in this section. The next type of practice I would do would be in simulated competition. And then finally, although it's not practice, it's competition, I would then do it in competition. And I would argue that competition is practice because we are always learning during competition. And I would argue that we probably learn more in competition than we do at any other stage. But I don't like people to be pushed into competition too early, although some people are confident and they can get away with it. Let me show you a couple of examples in the next lessons, and then you can see worked examples of me explaining this at the same time.